Hello and welcome everyone. You are listening to Off the Shelf, the MEDtalkx online book club, which we've been doing for a number of months now. But today we're going to be discussing this book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos by Jordan B Peterson. So I am joined by my usual co-hosts, Fahim Shakur, as well as Mebs Ahmed and Ray Radford, who you may have seen from our previous episodes. Hello, everyone.
Good evening, Mehran.
Good evening.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start to open the book in terms of my own understanding. And please, for whoever's watching, do interact, do ask questions, because it wasn't as controversial as how I started the book as how it ended. But in essence, it's a really interesting book from a professor in clinical psychology who applies his trade in University of Toronto. You may have seen him in the really famous Channel 4 interview a few years ago on how things around gender identity, as well as gender pay gap, as well as other key social topics, which he was quite prominent. And he was, if you actually look at that video, it's quite a good power differential that you can see within that conversation. But that got me interested in Jordan, and then it came up with this book. So in essence, this is a book which goes over our usual kind of recommended page allowance of 300 pages. So it's nearly 370 pages long. It's about 12 rules. So I will try and share a bit about the 12 rules. So which you should be able to see here. So so it talks about stand up straight, with your shoulders back, that being one, and ends with pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. So we'll certainly try to decipher what those are about. But in essence, I found this book quite challenging on numerous levels. He talks a lot about order and chaos, and he certainly sets it out within the contents of the order. So obviously, if you're interested about a rule, you will go to that rule and you will try to learn more about it. But it's the thing in between which I found very chaotic. So I found a lot of the chapters where the beginning of the rule and the end of the rule was probably all that was needed. And this kind of continued. There's lots of rules that I could understand. He clearly comes from a Judeo-Christian perspective, as well as uses numerous other kind of mythologies, as well as other philosophers such as Aristotle and Socrates to prove a point. So he's very well learned, but you can see that there is some omission, whether it's conscious or subconscious, and we will try to address that later on. But without me rambling too much about this book, I'm going to start with yourself, Fahim. What were your thoughts about this book?
Thank you, Mehran, for choosing the book. And thanks for the excellent summary to start the evening. So Jordan Peterson isn't someone I'd really come across prior to this recommendation. I had watched that Channel 4 interview that you mentioned, which gave a bit of background towards some of his viewpoints. And the rule book, in many ways, was quite interesting in what it's trying to portray. I think in a world where we're often struggling with self-help and trying to make the best of the pandemic, we're almost clutching at straws for guidance, and rules for life is a form of someone trying to be wise and portray and convey their wisdom in as much to the audience. I think at this point, it's worth mentioning that he has a follow-up book that's due out in a couple of months with another 12 rules. So maybe that's the background to that as well, as a continuation. In terms of this book, as you said, I think the first part and the end part were necessary. And then you do sometimes get lost in the middle of it, depending on whether you've read Lord of the Rings. Otherwise, certain sort of information about Tolkien's land won't make much sense to you unless you know the cultural references. And like you said, many come from a Judeo-Christian background. Having said that, he is a clinical psychologist, and that's important. It's important because three of us here are healthcare professionals, and we can use some of that to try and inform our practice and use some of that as well, which is what I've tried to take out of this book, especially certain chapters that we'll come on to, I'm sure, later on. But he does actually try and give some guidance that is universal, which I think we should all take on board, and other things which you may not benefit from, but I think that's up to each reader as well.
Thank you, Fahim. Over to you, Mebs. What were your thoughts about this book?
I think I would probably like to echo a lot of what Fahim has said, but for me, I'd never heard of Jordan Peterson, to be perfectly honest, and that perhaps shows a little bit of perhaps my lack of wider reading, and I did find the book quite difficult to read. I think that for me, it seems as if the book is aimed at sort of like professionals, perhaps in that clinical psychological profession. But there were some sorts rules that he talks about that did actually make sense, that I did find helpful. But a lot of the others, a lot of them, I found difficult to understand. I actually found the message in the title of the all 12 rules actually much more clear and very easy to understand. But then reading the text that follows, I did find that confusing and a little difficult to understand. But I am one of those people that actually likes to read material perhaps several times before it actually sinks in and makes sense. But having said that, overall, I mean, it's from what I've learned, it's obviously a very successful book. It sold millions, so perhaps that says more about my reading ability than the actual book itself. But whether it's difficult or easy to read. But as we'll discuss some of the points later on that you've sent out for discussion, where we'll discover some of my thoughts on those things.
Fantastic, thanks, Mebs. And Ray, I guess when we talked about this book, you are probably the the only one from us four who had actually heard of Jordan Peterson and had read the book. So I think you'd reread it for the purpose of this. So how did you find the book?
So interestingly, hearing your background to the book, I was introduced to Jordan Peterson by my son, who's 24 at the time. And of course, that is the archetypal presentation of people's interest in Jordan and what he's been writing. I first listened to the book as an audiobook a couple of years ago, and then I've actually read the book as well, which is always the best way to do it, I think, because you pick up a lot more when you're reading it and sit and think about it. I think it's just a book of distilled wisdom. And I think there shouldn't be anything controversial in it, because the whole book it's a book which summarizes how you can live your life and to be the best version of yourself. And I think it's also a warning. It's a warning, which is the chaos bit. The chaos bit he's talking about is based on his background and his knowledge, which is about looking at Russia and looking about what happened in Stalinist Russia, but also what happened in Nazi Germany. So he looks at as you've mentioned, the Christo-Didian background that we have, and that's his background. That's how he was brought up. And he's making the point that certainly in Western society, the one he understands, whether you're a believer in God or an active member of the church, nevertheless, your culture is based upon those learnings. And he begins the book with mentioning Moses and the commandments about rules. So there's that background. But the real chaos is this warning that in the West, despite hundreds of years and the Reformation and all the things that were done to improve society, somehow we ended up in World War II, where we had a left-wing communist ideology and arguably a right-wing Nazi ideology, which led to the deaths of, I think, 70 million people because of people losing track of what their own identity was and having the ability to question what they were doing. So I think that is the chaos bit. It really is a warning throughout the whole book, is to live your life the best you can and to not be influenced by dictatorship and by tyranny and by dogma, but to think clearly about your own place in society.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. And we're going to move on to the best bit about the book. And I guess for me, there's lots of snippets throughout the book, especially when it comes through from a psychologist perspective, as well as a humanist angle. There's lots of things such as if we each live properly, we will collectively flourish, and about the importance of taking responsibility. And the importance of actually asking for help in the right way. Choosing and appreciating the people around you, and being ever present about being precise in your speech. But so there's lots of little areas of wisdom scattered throughout this book. I think I found myself having to search quite hard for it at times, but nevertheless it's there. So I'm going to start with you, Fahim. What did you find best about the book?
Yeah, I think certain chapters is probably the best way to say what I found best, especially Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie. I think that's a good maxim for life and explanation. I think we all make mistakes in whatever field of work or personal life we're in, but you do want to make sure at least you're telling the truth and fess up, I guess, even when it doesn't work out well. So that's good. I think Rule 10 is interesting about the precision in speech, because you can actually extrapolate from that to actual precision in life in general. Not just speech, but in written work, interactions. Precision is important in a time-constrained world. So I'd say the best parts are probably the chapters that I found the most useful, which for me were, as I said, Rule 10, the precision, telling the truth. 8, although that's a golden maxim that I think everyone should know. As we had a discussion with Mebs off air, it's sometimes good to be reminded about these things. Even though we know these things, it's always good to have a reminder. And also, I think Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. That's a really interesting one, because I think it's easy to have fair-weathered friends and friends when you're successful and doing well, but actually it's quite a wise saying to actually think carefully about who your friends are, because you become like your friends, in the terms of birds of a feather flock together, but also you actually take on the nature of your friends. So that's really quite an important, and you can look at his chapters in many different ways and take out what's good from them in each way. So I'd probably say those 3 chapters.
Great, thank you. Ray, I'm going to come to you now. The best bit about the book?
Well, I've really enjoyed reading the book, because there's so many things will to me have resonated with my own thinking. Had a few interesting periods through life with illness and various things where I found myself wondering what everything is about. And there's so many stories in the book which really do resonate with my own experience. I think all the rules are to me very useful. One of the bits that made me laugh out loud was a story about how to look after your children, and how to discipline your children effectively under the rule don't make your children someone you hate. I was looking after my friend's child when he was young, and he was in the middle of a divorce, and his child was playing off his mum against his dad and screaming, "I want to go home! I want to go home! I don't want to go to sleep." And my friend was just like, "Well, I don't know what to do with him." And it very much as Jordan said, I basically, in the nicest possible way, let him know who was in charge. And he went to sleep. And the next morning, his best buddies. That happened about 15 years ago. He rang me up a month ago when he was ill. I didn't scare him. I didn't turn him into a gibbering wreck or destroy his life. He actually learned that you have to behave reasonably, even when you're a child. So yeah, there's so many of the rules really resonate.
Yeah, I think that chapter, I found myself laughing through quite snippets of it. Just I could relate, and just observing through, social encounters with other friends and how they interact and things like that. But yeah, it's just the dance, how the powers kind of translated between child and him, as not even as a parent, but like just as adult, how he imposes that. So that was quite interesting. Mebs, what are your thoughts? Which was the best bit of the book?
The ones that I could understand, I think I enjoyed those that I did understand, and I think that one of the things that really stands out for me is about having those difficult conversations, whether it's with your partner, whether it's with your children, a little bit of what Ray has actually mentioned as well, but whether it's at work. I think he also Peterson also talks about, and some of the interviews he's done about agreeable people. And it's actually, if you do want to get somewhere, if you do want to have a successful relationship, whether you want to have a successful career, you do need to have those difficult conversations. It's having that courage to be able to have those difficult conversations. And when you're talking about relationships, Ray talked about the example he gave about a child, but it also actually, it's true within sort of like with your partner or your wife or your husband. There are things that sometimes we acquiesce with when we shouldn't be doing, and we should really be perhaps, I don't really like the word challenging, but actually addressing in a bit more perhaps assertive way, but which is actually not avoiding the issue, dealing with the issue, taking that responsibility to deal with the issue, so that it doesn't actually gradually get worse, because once you start avoiding an issue, it does get worse, and the problem becomes bigger. So therefore, I think that there's lots of advice like that, with various rules that Peterson talks about, which I quite liked.
Yeah, when he talks about act of God, when really there's enough evidence there for actually humans to and people to actually put things in place when it comes to the New Orleans disaster, for example, or other kind of what's deemed as natural disasters could have actually been prevented or mitigated quite profoundly if we had taken the right steps at the right time. Great. So Ray, what did you like least about this book?
I think I'd echo some of the things you guys said at the beginning. It's not an easy read. You've got to sit and think. It takes a bit of time. I think, as Meb said, sometimes he kind of jumps around. So if you're not familiar with The Simpsons and Lord of the Rings and all the references he makes, then yeah, you maybe lose some of the bits that are actually quite funny. All the references to the Bible. I'm not a Bible reader. I could have done with a little bit of that. I think any of the cultural stuff. I mean, I've read a fair bit of Greek mythology, which I love, and I can see all the stories and the wisdom that comes from that. So I guess we could have used any reference. It could have been, Greek mythology. It could have been Native American learning, which he's quite familiar with. But I did find that, for me, I wasn't so interested in reading the bits about Cain and Abel, etc.
Yeah, Fahim, what are your thoughts? What didn't you like about this book?
Yeah, I think it's quite challenging in some ways to actually get through it in one sitting. I think he just flipped from one subject matter to another and different things. You got Carl Rogers, a psychotherapist, coming in, and then you've got Jung, and then you've got some Chinese philosophy coming in. It just seems a bit all over the place sometimes, almost as if I'm quite well learned, I'm quite sophisticated. Look at the repertoire of things I'm going to bring into the book. They don't really marry up quite nicely anyway. It's a bit hodgepodge, really. So I think that's part of it. I think also the stuff about lobsters right at the beginning is problematic for me, trying to extrapolate from something, that I'm just used to having on my dish to trying to say this is how order and chaos is from the way lobsters and so on. I think, there's obviously a lot of evolutionary biology that he's extrapolating, and although a lot of people agree with evolution and things, that's fine. It's just to what extent you can actually use order and chaos from that, as opposed to just the Darwinian part. So I think he does go over into quite a lot of those sort of things. So I think some of that's problematic, obviously, from my own religious faith. Some of the things that Ray's talked about in terms of cable, and obviously some of the way the scriptures are dealt with may not be exactly how I believe them to be as well. So I think it's important to be well versed in your own traditions, or religious or otherwise, before coming to this book. Otherwise, if you come in as an empty vessel, you'll just have it filled up with whatever knowledge is here, which is fine. But if you come into it with your own cultural or frames of references and religious perspectives, you've got to bear that in mind, and then also handle the book with that on top, which I think can cause some issues with this book. Yeah,
no, I guess it's fair to say you wouldn't come to this book being an empty vessel, because it's clearly it's that genre, isn't it? It's that kind of detail, that kind of message it's trying to portray. But yeah, I agree with the whole use of lobsters. I guess he was trying to say about the position of posture and what that actually means, most metaphysically using lobsters, but as we know, animal behavior, as well as correlating it to human behavior, it's very different. Animals don't have to deal with the X number of tasks, or the the demands as a human. So it can't be transferable. But I thought it was quite interesting how he used the lobster to try and prove a point. And I guess it gives a very kind of vivid image for someone to try to understand what he's trying to say there. Mebs, what did you not like about the book?
You mean apart from running for the dictionary every so often? I think we shared some of my thoughts on this off the air as well. I think that I did find it difficult most of the book to read. I think that perhaps it was aimed at people who are familiar with the work of well-known philosophers and psychologists and maybe other academics, and that might have been the target audience. But for ordinary people, and with all due respect to ordinary people, I'm sure that they're all better than me. It is a little bit difficult to understand some of the metaphors. And like I said before, I think that I would probably have to read it 3 or 4 times to understand the vast majority of the book. Some of the rules are quite, even for me, easy to understand, but others are very difficult.
I think he follows his forte about being precise in his speech. I think every sentence has got inherent value which you have to focus and understand, otherwise you get lost. And I found myself getting lost numerous times, but it's just, and I think everyone's kind of experienced that to some degree. Okay, so Fahim, did he bring order and chaos to you, or what do you understand by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Order and chaos. I mean, if you're familiar with chaos theory and just structure, I think when you go to some other stuff, he talks about atoms, quarks, and so on, and at the subatomic level, which is quite interesting because obviously with a physics, chemistry background, even at A level, looking at subatomic particles and how we get order and how the normal condition is for things to be disordered and then to change into order. When you think about the book that way, no, I didn't find it giving me order and chaos, especially with the title, An Antidote to Chaos. I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because what do we mean an antidote to mean? That means the opposite is a poison. That's what an antidote does. It fixes it. A bit like a vaccine for a virus, antidote to poison. Life is chaos and bring order to it. So I think it's quite a far-reaching accolade to give it to the book if you're saying it's bringing order to everything. I think it is what it says on the tin. It's a set of rules from someone who's distilling their wisdom, as Ray said at the beginning. Whether you see that as order and chaos, well, I think it depends on your cultural reference. This book is obviously, I think, aimed at the Western market. There's, I'm not sure how useful it would be in China or just different parts of Asia, trying to read through these references and so on. I don't think it's really meaningful for billions of people out there in the world. It's made for a Eurocentric and American sort of audience. And I think for other parts with, just the way it looks at, how pets are looked at and, different things like this, that we all have different values on this depending on which culture you're from. Certain parts of the world, you eat those things that he's talking about. So there's a lot of generalizations in what he's trying to explain to everything, to give some points. And to me, that's not always bringing out order and at the opposite, chaos. But it's a very good title. It hooks you in with that title. You're always trying to think about where is the order in this book. And the order is probably in the way he sets out the sentences. They're very orderly in that sense. And then the chaos is obviously, like I said, the way he's trying to rationalize all that. To me, that was chaotic in a way.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to take your thoughts on this, Ray, because I think in Rule 2, he talks about chaos as freedom, dreadful freedom, and then also talks about order being potentially quite filled with tyranny. So what did you come away with when we talk about order and chaos?
Well, I mean, I say I've read the book, I've listened to the book, I've watched quite a few of his talks. So I've got a more, hopefully, a slightly more in-depth understanding. It's not just my first pass, and I agree with what you've said. As a first pass reading this book, you do need to read it more than once, probably every chapter, if not every sentence, because it can be hard work. But I think the chaos is twofold. The chaos is what happens when order becomes too strict. So the chaos is if you go down the route of tyranny, like we talked about in the Soviet times, under Stalin or under Hitler in Germany, when there's so much order and you lose all freedom. That's one level of the chaos where things really become extremely bad for everybody. And the other is more personal, which is if you don't take personal responsibility and you decide you're going to be a victim and everything is someone else's fault and you take no personal responsibility, then that's also chaos, but that's chaos within your own mind. And he talks in several parts of the book where you can just descend into this pit of self-pity, which is then extremely difficult to get out from. So to me, that's chaos. It's both a personal thing and an organizational thing. And the order is to take responsibility for your own life and your own existence, and to do things that are meaningful, and to tell the truth, and to get on with people, and to listen to people properly. And if you start down that route and you do meaningful things, your own life will improve. But then it's also important, as we were saying, to talk the truth and to challenge things, because other people don't always have your best interest at heart. And if you're following a dogma and it's unquestionable and it can't be challenged, the evidence of history repeatedly is, if we get into that state, things rapidly descend into tyranny and lots of death. And to me, that is the key message of the book.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say pretty much every revolution starts with that kind of steps, isn't it? But yeah, no, I found it quite interesting how he referred to women as being the controlling feature of chaos. Men approach women, women say no, chaos. I don't know what your thoughts were, Mebs, about what order and chaos mean to you.
Yeah, I think that, as I said, I mean, I've only read the book once, and so I'm not going to say that it's become my Bible, if you know what I mean, to life. I think that there are things in there that do make sense, that if you don't take responsibility, as Ray was saying, that there is going to be some sort of chaos in your life. If you don't address things, if you don't deal with things, if you don't even, sort of like, I mean, I've read more of Stephen Covey's work. I don't know whether you're familiar with his work, and he talks about principle-led leadership and 7 habits of highly effective people. And there are things that are quite similar, that you've got to look to yourself. You've got to take responsibility. You've got to address things, and then if you don't, and I mean, Ray's talked about sort of like the past and what's happened in Russia and with the Second World War as well. I mean, those are your ultimate chaoses, aren't they, really? But we're talking about sort of like everyday life, here at the moment now, and how people, if they don't take responsibility, there is going to be chaos of a variety of ways that chaos is going to impact on people. And you only bring about order by taking responsibility. And Ray talked about, not playing the victim and blaming everybody else. I think that's actually, there's more of that today than ever in the past. And whether I'm being sort of like living in the past, I don't know, because of my age, but I do see young people that I've worked with are looking at, what should be their rights, what should be given to them, instead of sort of like perhaps even working for it, or perhaps even earning it as I was taught by my parents. So I think that brings in itself, in its own chaos, and I think that teaching children, which is, again, can be difficult for people, some principles and getting them to adhere to them for their future, which actually sets them up for the future. And part of these, some of the rules that Peterson talks about, I think will provide some of that order for some people.
So, Mibs, which rules did you find yourself agreeing with specifically? I know we've kind of touched on various ones, but which one really strings out, saying, you know what, if I read this book, which you have, this is what I want to really hold on to?
Well, I mean, I think the first rule for me has made a lot of sense, and it made a lot of sense because it actually rings true with me, using myself as an example. Because I used to walk around with my head down, shoulders sort of like, crouched, and sort of like not even looking up, thinking that, oh my God, I dare not look up because I may do something wrong. I might look at somebody in a wrong way, or I may say something wrong, and I was bringing everything back to me and blaming myself. And that's the opposite of being the victim, in a sense, But actually, I've only read Peterson's book just recently, but I met a very special person who told me to look at the world differently. Take responsibility for yourself and stand up for yourself. Get your head up, put your shoulders back, and look at the world as if it's something you can learn from. It's not something that is totally, your fault and you're destroying it, and everything is your fault. But every meeting that you have, every interaction that you have will teach you something if you open up your mind. And that made that first rule made a lot of sense to me.
Who's this special person, Meps? You'll tell us.
Yeah.
Who's the special person?
Yeah. Well, I think we're lucky to get, more than one special person in our lives. But, there are special persons, and I've been fortunate enough to meet a few who have helped to shape my thought process and my perspectives.
You haven't answered Fahim's question, Mems, but we'll let that one go.
Did I say I was going to be a politician as well?
Ray, well, which one really kind of resonated with you? Because I know that there are a couple of rules that you felt that you could relate, in terms of growing up and parenting, etc.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking at them again, and I'm thinking when I reread the book, I think the rule 7: pursue what is meaningful, and not what is being. And I think Mebs has touched on it a little bit. I think the way we are now in our modern world, and now we've been in lockdown for a year, and it's going to continue. I think so many people are probably wondering just what is life really about? Why do we exist? And we're now being told we've got to stay in our homes, and we can't go out, and we can't see our loved ones, and we can't go to weddings, we can't go to funerals. Well, why do we exist? So I think more than any other time, I think that particular rule is really, really pertinent now. Now, so many young people are influenced by social media and by image and by celebrity, and of course, none of the things have any real meaning. It's all completely false. So I think more than anything, that is the main rule in this book for me. I think I'm extremely fortunate. I have a job I love, that I'm good at, that I've practiced hard to get good at. I get fantastic results. I get praise from patients regularly. I can see patients can see again. And I've worked for 25, 30 years to achieve that. And it was really hard work. At times I thought I'd fail. At times I thought I'd leave and walk away, but I carried on. I carried on working as hard as I could. People have told me I wouldn't be able to do it. You meet lots of people who are not supportive. It goes back to the other rule about surround yourself by people who care for you. There's so many pertinent and, for me, quite simple rules. But as I say, I think that for now, more than any other time, that rule is the number one.
Yeah, no, it's very well put. I think it's important to be around the right group of people, even in marriage. Making there's clear benefits of marriage, and having that critic as well as that encouraging additional voice can only be a good thing. So, but yeah, the important thing is, as you said, perseverance. We all want to be. I think we should all aim to be farmers, not Bitcoin investors. That's how I came across after reading that book. Fahim, which rule? I know you've got a huge list.
Yeah, no, not. No. Yeah, coming back to Bitcoins, I think they've gone up in price recently, so I'm holding fire on that. Yeah. Well, I'll come back to what I said. Rule 8, tell the truth or at least don't lie. I think this is why this is really important, is not just professionally and personally, because like I said, we make mistakes, and you've got to tell the truth at least when you do make a mistake, or just generally the concept of not, or even not, at least don't lie. That's useful in that if you don't want to hurt someone's feelings and you don't want to tell them exactly, in a blunt fashion, it's basically going towards a bit of diplomacy, and that's useful in life. So I think there's a time to when you tell a spade like a spade, you tell people exactly how it is, and there's a time to actually just to not manipulate the truth, but at least not lie, and that's a useful skill to have. So I found that bit, chapter 8, as a universal truth. There's no benefit in lying at all in any circumstance, really. I don't see any benefit to that. So seeing the truth, telling the truth, as he talks about, and even how he finishes that chapter, tell the truth or at least don't lie. I think that will stay for me from this book.
Great. So I guess the bit that doesn't stay for you, Fahim?
The rest of the book, no. No, I think it is the things that are not staying is obviously the things that I said that are problematic from religious perspective for me is something that I can obviously skip over, and also the bits about where you're just trying to make things fill in. In many ways, I felt like the book was a first draft. I mean, as I said to you before, he's got another book coming out in about 3 months' time. How does that work if you're writing 2 books in such quick succession? This came out only in 2018. That means you've got a phenomenal output. And sometimes you need corrections and things. If you look at some of the great classics, Vikram Seth, Suitable Boy, it took him many years to write that book. So this concept of that genius of being able to churn out things first time, every time, whether it is a first draft or not, I think is something that I'd be interested. It'd be useful for the author to be able to say. But yeah, I think things like that, where obviously the perspective isn't relevant to the rest of the world, and in terms of trying to put your perspective from a Western upbringing and extrapolating for the rest of the world, which is the majority of the population, I don't think that always fits in. I don't think it's meant for the streets of South Asia, for instance, this book, where sometimes you can get copies being sold on the streets and so on. I don't think it's meant for that kind of book.
Mabs, which rule did you disagree with?
Well, I think that I really have to stick by what I said earlier. I can't sort of say I agree and disagree with the rules that I don't understand. So rules 5, 11, and 12 I found difficult to understand. So it would be difficult for me to say that, I really agree with them and they made sense to me when they didn't. So, hello, are you still there?
Yeah. I'm just trying to.
Okay. I thought I'd lost you then.
Okay. No, I'm still here.
Yeah, Ray, I'm not very good with IT, so I think anything different that they do, it just puts me off. I don't know what's happened, and I panic.
Don't worry, Mabs. I know it's happened before. So.
Yeah, so I think 5, 11, and 12 were difficult for me to understand. I'd have to read them several times. And as Ray said, I mean, he's read the book. I heard the book several times. So, I'm not dismissing anything in there after hand, because I think that would be a mistake. When you don't understand something, you dismiss it. That's wrong for me. I think you've got to try and understand first before you sort of like make up your mind and say, no, I don't agree with that. You've got to understand it.
Yeah, state of continuous learning, isn't it, Mabs?
Yeah.
Ray, which bit?
I think all the rules have their own. He's a very deep thinker, and that's why it's hard to wade through some of these chapters. There's over 300 references, or 200 odd references, 290 references. Yeah. He'll have read them all. He'll have read every word of every one of those references. And this book is actually a summary for him. This book is a summary of his other book, which is called Maps of Meaning, which by his own estimation is the most impenetrable book possible, which is a book of psychology that's as deep can be, which I haven't started to read and probably won't even try to read. I think I'd rather read the summary, which is this book, and that's hard enough. Yeah, but no, I think all the rules have some validity.
Yeah, I actually found it quite interesting about the coda at the end. This is the first time I've actually come across the coda segment to the book, but it was just nicely written. It just flowed very potentially beautifully, I could say. Just putting out questions and then giving a quite a profound answer in not many few few words. So I thought, that was certainly interesting, and I think again that's probably something that we'll spend time reading and spending a bit more time with. But yeah, rules. A lot of these rules are quite supposed to be generic. I fully agree with you, Fahim, that somewhere on, let's say, the streets of India may not be applicable. But I guess it's very difficult to argue that any of these rules are wrong. It's just around circumstance and what kind of part of your life you've experienced those things. Okay, so what alternatives to the 12 rules, Ray, do you sometimes make reference to? It doesn't have to be a divine form. It could be, a man-made set of rules. Because I do like to listen to motivational speakers. Jim Rohn is quite a popular one, and he's got lots of nuggets of wisdom just about productivity, personal development, about friendships, about X, Y, and Z. So I don't know if there were any specific rules that you specifically follow.
I've read a lot of philosophy. I like all the ancient Greek philosophy. When I've been off this year, I've read and listened to several books of philosophy. I just find the whole concept interesting. So probably quite hard for me now to think of what's my main tenet. I don't think I have one. I just think I'm really interested in the whole subject. So I don't think there's one. I do think truth is really important, and that's probably something I've always said. Truth is really important, because if you don't tell the truth to yourself, then how can you tell the truth to anybody else? And if you're not telling yourself your own truths, then you're probably heading to a dark place.
Yeah, no, I agree. Fahim, what alternatives do you make reference to?
Yeah, I think the alternative is a book by Ralph Nader. He talks about the 17 traditions. He was obviously 4-month unsuccessful US presidential candidate. He wrote that book many years ago, prior to this book. And it's a good book to compare this one with. He talks about many different things about sharing meals together as a family and so on. So I thought that was an interesting one to compare it to. Obviously, Stephen Covey, that Mebs alluded to earlier, is a great person in this whole realm of self-help. His 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, really good book. Maybe we'll do that another time, especially Sharpen the Saw and all of these things. They just become legendary folklore, some of his sayings. So I think there's obviously a whole world of, thinkers, Steven Pinker, a lot of these psychologists who are out there, Daniel Kahneman and so on, who've got their own rules. And I think coming back to when you think about rules, I think whether you believe it or not, the 10 Commandments, right? And I know we basically talked about it at the beginning, but the 10 Commandments are the 10 Commandments. I think they may be for a Judeo-Christian background, but I think pretty much a lot of people know about them. And it's a good place to have a discussion about where rules are formulated from, how they're made, written on tablets of stone, codified, non-codified. In a way, they give you a real good background as to how rulings came about, again, at a time of chaos, then they came out to bring order and so on. So in that sense, I'm always reminded about the 10 Commandments when I think of a book like this.
Yeah, so that divinity, isn't it? Divinity and the 10 Commandments, the 5 pillars, the list goes on. Mebs, what would you like to say?
Just listening to Fahim and Ray, sort of really gives me a clear picture of how unread I am, and my sort of like what I would say to answer your question is that actually, it isn't about what I've read or even actually something from a religious text, but it's from a totally uneducated man who'd never been to school, who was my father, and he always said to me that your life is worthless unless it's of service to others. And that's what I've tried to follow as much as I could in my life. And that's what I'd like to hope that my children would.
Yeah, that's beautifully laid out words there, Mebs. Yeah, no, I fully agree. There's so much to talk about this, and I think that, the impact is something that doesn't happen today. It'll happen as time goes on. I know we're running out of time. We've only got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to try and pursue the other areas of discussion. So one of the key things I came back with, Ray, with this book is about him saying life is suffering. Is life suffering from your perspective?
Yes.
That's why we have you on, Ray.
I've been quite ill a few times, and I've been off work. And when you start at home for months, and you think what the meaning of life is, and you sit and think deeply about, well, what do you really need? What do you really need? You need shelter, you need food, you need water, you probably need a bit of company, and that's about it. That's the basic sort of tenets, and most philosophy is based on that, because that is all there is. And you're only, you come into existence, and then your life has a certain time span, and then you're gone. And that's it. And in between those two periods, you're going to have ill health almost certainly at some point. You're going to be ill in some way, and you're going to get some pain. And if you interact with people, it might not be nice to you. And if you do a job, you might not get your own way. And if you play sport, you're going to get hurt. And if you go out to the pub as a young man, you're probably going to get punched in the face once or twice, perhaps. Things hurt. You get suffered. When you fall in love with someone, they might not love you back, and you'll get hurt. Terrible things happen where relatives and loved ones die. You're going to get hurt. So life is full of suffering. And most of what we do is about trying to escape from that harsh reality by filling our life with meaning and purpose or distraction. And he touches it in the book. You could fill your life if you had all the money available and you could have anything you wanted and you could just live a life of avarice and luxury, you still wouldn't be happy. You actually need some purpose. So I think without purpose, then you do suffer, because you slowly drive yourself insane. And I think that is a large part of those very deep conversations he's having. And he refers to Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and all these other philosophies and writers. Much of that is what he's talking about. And we did go through a period in the Judean sort of Christian world where believing in Christ and going to church and saying your prayers was your salvation. And including in the West, going to church is much less common. A lot of people do still hold those views, but it's much less so. People are more into the capitalist system, and now we have social media, and now we have the threat of artificial intelligence, and we have the media controlling what we think and what we get to say, and there's the polarization. If you've ever looked at Brave New World, and when you've read 1984, these books are really pertinent to where we're heading now. So I really see this book as a real warning note to where we've come from and where we may be heading to.
Yeah, no, but at the same time, if I say, is life happiness? You could potentially say all those things about happiness. All the specific moments of joy. Do you know what I mean? But it's the way he comes across by saying it's.
Thank goodness they exist.
Well, yeah, exactly. Mebs, do you think life is suffering?
Without a doubt. I think that there's suffering in everyone's life. Only the degree of suffering actually varies from person to person, perhaps from country to country as well. And as does the resilience and tolerance of people as well. I think that varies. But for me, I think, it is actually often the causes that are the same. Ray's mentioned about illness, there's poverty, there's inequality, and there's greed. And all those sorts of things actually do cause suffering for an awful lot of people. It's caused wars in the past as well. When you talk about difference and disagreements, they cause wars. They cause suffering, people dying, millions of people dying, even within sort of like looking at our own, my parents' countries like India and Pakistan. India was one country. When separation took place, millions died. That caused suffering. So yeah, I think that there's the everyday suffering as well for people. Perhaps people who can't get jobs these days. And this lockdown, that's causing massive amounts of suffering and mental health for lots of people. So yeah, life is about suffering, but it's also about then how we deal with it. And that's what makes difference to most people's life. If they're not prepared for suffering, if they're not being shown how to deal with difficult times, they're going to struggle even more. And those people that perhaps have got some resilience and tolerance, maybe they're able to cope better.
I think he tries to address that question by saying, on rule 4, we are not equal in ability or outcome. And he's trying to say that, it's okay to feel that way, but sometimes things are made in a certain way, and there's only so much you can do. It's kind of focusing on what you can do and being a bit more introspective. But for him, is life suffering, or is it more just a tragedy?
Sounds quite Shakespearean the way you put it there. I think three of us are doctors here. Obviously, we'd be out of a job if we're not there to alleviate suffering, because obviously medicine deals with that. So I think it's important to touch upon that point. We'd be out of a job literally if there was no suffering in the world. Having said that, we do try and mitigate and reduce as much of that in our respective fields. I think the opposite, as you alluded to, suffering is happiness, and then with one, the other goes as well. So you're going to have a complex line of happiness to suffering, and that's all part of the game of life, so to speak. I think in terms of suffering as a concept, it really relates to Buddhism in a strong way, in terms of the noble truths as in that, but also the other religions. I can speak more freely on Islam coming from that background, but obviously we're asked to deal with suffering. Sometimes it can even be seen as a blessing because you remember the creator in suffering. So there's many different ways that looking at suffering, how not only the metaphysical in terms of physical, emotional suffering, but also how you alleviate it, and also how the rest of society deals with suffering. So even a farmer can say, I try and mitigate suffering because look at me, what I'm doing in terms of famines, or a driving instructor, look at me, I'm preventing people dying, because if you don't drive your car properly, there could be people going on. So I think in many ways, in order to get credibility and so on, a lot of occupations and way people are interacting, they have to show that they're trying to alleviate suffering, as opposed to the inverse, which is causing oppression or suffering on someone else. I don't think people generally want to own up to that or say that's what their lifestyle or their living or their modus operandi is causing people. So yeah, in summary, suffering is a part of life. Do I think it's the only part of life? No, because then we'd really be in a mess. But it is important, and it's coming to more focus clearly with this pandemic, how we're all suffering in different ways. Not just what Ray said in terms of, being locked up and cooped up, but I think in some ways that's the first world problems. Other people are having it in terms of much worse, and how it can actually affect you in terms of getting problems. In some ways lockdown is a first world luxury. You can't have that in certain parts of the world. You have to keep the shops open, you have to keep things open for business, and that takes priority over health. And I think sometimes seeing other people suffering brings it closer to home. We can understand things a bit better than if we're just looking at our own perspective of going to work and back, and this is the only suffering, or just reading the newspaper. We've got to take a more active, interesting look at the wider perspectives and determinants of suffering.
Yeah, so I guess maybe I'm in a minority here, because I always see life, it doesn't include suffering, but at the same time it includes an opportunity, because I just feel everyone's given a specific purpose to try and help make the difficult things in life at least feel a bit better. So everyone's got that purpose, and he talks about the trying to find that purpose and the meaning in life, and certainly that's something I came away from this book in terms of the importance of that. Is this book divisive, Ray? Did you feel division?
I didn't personally division, anything but. But say I've followed Peterson for a few years now, so I'm fully aware that some people have found it very divisive. But like we discussed off air, I think if you already come in with an agenda, if you've already decided that you don't want to hear what you're going to hear, and you're probably going to take the opposite viewpoint, full stop. I don't think he is either left wing or right wing. I think he's a philosopher. He's looking at lots of ancient wisdom. He's taking resources from all over the place, and I think he's earnestly tried to give. I don't think the rules as such. It's 12 pieces of guidance, which if you try to follow them, you'll probably make your life better and make the people's life around you better.
Yeah, I think he's very much against the far of anything, isn't it? Far left or far right. I think he very much opposes that, and it's that kind of very centrist position that he holds. I think that's quite apparent. For him, did you find it divisive?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important what Ray says, though. I think when you come into it knowing some of the speaker's background, he is known as a controversial person. I think it's fair to say that. And controversy leads to sales. We know that as well. And having looked at some of the lectures and debates, I think I'd probably differ with Ray. I think in some ways he's described as a right-winger. He may not be far right, but I think some of his views would be taken in terms of the political spectrum. Now, whether that's the same as mine or not, I don't think is the question, but it's good to at least read books of different political leanings on the spectrum. Divisiveness, yeah, I think there have been a couple of episodes which could be termed Islamophobic in some of his things. So if you transpose that, and I don't think you can always separate the author from the book, because otherwise, there are certain books which people would not read, perhaps due to their unpleasantness in terms of the writer, as if almost giving vindication to it via sales and so on. So in that sense, yeah, there is some division in who is the audience for this book. And I would argue the main audience is white males in the West. And I think that's often his audience. If it was much more in keeping with the minorities, women, and everything else, and if it was much more equal in terms of the audiences, then you could say it was less divisive. But as we know, that's the most of the audience, and he's admitted that freely, then it lends itself to thinking there may be some divisiveness in certain things, especially when you focus in on Judeo-Christian values for something you want to be universal. I think that can come across as divisive because that really doesn't branch out to billions of people in the world. So I think it's interesting. It's going to be divisive because you're trying to bring a self-help book with rules without promoting one religion per se, because it's self-help and so it's based on secular values. But at the same time, you've got to plump for a few things and not the whole lot. So it's going to cause division to a degree, isn't it? Logically.
Mebs?
Well, I go back to what I said earlier. It's from what I understand of the book. I would say no. It isn't. I think that there are lots of sort of like chapters and rules that I'm yet to understand. So that might give me a clearer picture when I read them several times over. But as it stands, no. I think that for me, I have seen some of the interviews and that Channel 4 interviews as well. I think that I am nowhere near understanding what Jordan Peterson is about, because I'm just starting to get to know about Mr. Peterson, and this is the first book that I've even attempted to read. So that I wouldn't say I understand Mr. Peterson at all, and what his aims, thoughts, and sort of like views on lots of different things are. I saw the clip on sort of like the gender pay gap as well, and even though the interview tried to put and question several times about his thoughts about women and their barriers to the top, he was very clear in what he was trying to say, and I think that I couldn't really say that he was actually anti-women because of what he was saying. I think he was trying to explain things that perhaps are not clearly understood. And I think that when Ray talks about he's a very, very deep thinker and perhaps a deep person, when somebody at that level is trying to sort of like get, and I say this in quotes, masses to understand, it is going to cause perhaps lack of understanding and perhaps even divisiveness as well, because people don't understand. So at this stage, as I say, I'm going to say no.
So I think it's just really interesting, isn't it? Because it's and certainly maps of meaning isn't for you, Mebs. I'll say that. I'll say that for certain.
Sorry, can I just look that up in the dictionary? What did you say?
So I think the divisiveness, it's obviously it's difficult sometimes and I didn't go into this choice of book knowing everything that I knew. And at the same time, I've just continued because the show must go on, and I thought I have learned something from this book, but at the same time, the divisiveness, I think he clearly exploded. He's from the.
Not me or you?
I have no idea where that's coming from.
I'm on low battery, so it's one of my computer singing songs to me.
All right, okay. But I just think he's coming from a state of ignorance, in the sense that he doesn't know all the in terms of religious faith. He's very much come from a Judeo-Christian perspective, which is fine, but at the same time kind of rejecting people like Avicenna or Ibn Sina, one of the greatest philosophers, and I fully agree with the use of Aristotle and Socrates, because that's probably integral to his psychology training, etc. So I think there's potential divisiveness there, but I didn't feel with the 12 rules itself he was very divisive. I think that's, as we've all talked about, it's areas of guidance. And I think that's probably our cue to try and end, because someone's going to disappear anytime soon. But Fahim, I'm going to go to you. What's our next book? Oh, okay.
Fahim's gone.
I think it looks like it's Fahim. Okay, so let's see if he joins us. But if he doesn't, I'll try to introduce our next book. I'll try and share my screen doing that. So it's a book called The 4-Pillar Plan. It's by Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, very famous individual, lives in the Northwest, and clearly he's got lots of things to say. Fahim's back. Okay, maybe he's not. That's what's going to be our next topic of discussion. So that's on the 31st of January, and same time, same place, 8 to 9. So hopefully I'll see you guys there. Thanks again, Mebs and Ray, for contributing to this discussion. I know that you joined late, Ray, but clearly you're one of the experts, as you had read the book previously. So thanks again.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Really enjoyed that.